Hi, my name is Brett, and this is episode 3 of Test-Driven R-Spec, a series where we deep dive into using R-Spec for writing tests in Ruby and Rails apps. In this episode, we're going to dive into configuring R-Spec so that in future episodes we have everything configured as we want to. When you first install R-Spec in your Rails app, right, you'd add it to your gem file, you'd add rspec-rails to your gem file, and then you'd run bundle install. It's going to install all your dependencies listed in your gem file, which is great. Then the next step is to actually generate the RSpec files that are needed for your application. So then you run Rails generate RSpec install. And this generates 3 files, a .rspec file in the root directory of your app, your spec helper, and your Rails helper. Now when I ran it, I already have these files, so it's just going to try to create them again. If they already exist, it doesn't create them. It says there's a conflict in my Rails helper. That's because in the last episode, we actually made an adjustment there. So I'm actually going to hit no to this prompt and say, don't overwrite it, skip it. So now I have the 3 files as they were when I started this episode. But if you have a new app, you just run that and it'll create those files. Now, let's dive into what each of those files does. So that first file is a .rspec file. RSpec, when you run the RSpec command, like if you were to run bin RSpec or bundle exec RSpec, it automatically loads the .rspec file. And that allows you to require files as needed. You can see by default, it loads the spec helper file, so that if we were to just create a test, like if we created a spec, test spec, that's a bad name, but let's just run with it for a second and do rspec.describe. We'll say that it works. And if we do it works. This is bad, but we're just going to show you for example. So we'll say that expect 10 to equal 10, right? So that should pass. Now if we run bundle exec rspec, spec test spec, it should work because it's automatically including the spec helper. That's why we didn't have to require spec helper here. Generally, still like to require it there so it's clear what you're loading, but this by default is just loading spec helper. And other changes we can make in this .rspec file are things like the format of RSpec. So you could do format doc, and that should change what happens when we actually run the test. So now, instead of using the default dot syntax when it runs the tests, it's actually using the documentation format, which outputs all of the info from the describes and the examples. So like if I were to change it works to, we'll just say testing RSpec, and we'll just say it works. We'll keep that the same, run it again. Now we'll see the top level describe and it works. If I run the whole test suite, so if I just do bin RSpec, we're going to see all of the tests get output in the doc format. Let me clear the screen and run that again so that it's a little easier to read. So we have consoles request, which is from the last episode. It makes an API request to get/consoles, and we see all of the examples. It returns an array of the consoles. It supports specifying consoles for a specific manufacturer. It returns a status message, and then the one we just added, it works. So the doc format is kind of nice. And any option that you can pass into RSpec, like if we just do RSpec help, we'll see the documentation for RSpec, and then any options that you can pass here, you can just configure in your .rspec file for your whole project for all of your team members. So this can be kind of nice. Like we just configured the format. This is kind of nice, but it's you can also just configure it in various different parts of your app. So good to know, but I usually don't end up modifying this .rspec file too much. And specifically for that format doc output, it's usually really verbose, where like I'll just remove it there and then we'll run the test suite again. I like the dots because once you have, let's say, dozens of tests or hundreds of tests, you don't want to have hundreds of lines or dozens of lines being output when you run your test suite, right? Having just these dots show is enough to know that, okay, it's passing, and then when your tests fail, you'll know exactly which ones failed. So that is your spec helper file. Now we're going to dive into, that's the .rspec file. Now we're going to dive into the spec helper, the second file that gets generated. And in modern RSpec, gem versions, there's lots of documentation output. So it can be a little overwhelming at first. So I want to walk through what it does, and hopefully you'll be able to configure your test suite as you would prefer it for your app. So this file is generated by the Rails generate R-Spec install command, which we saw. It's always loaded, so you even have context there, which is really nice as to what this is doing. So I'd recommend reading through it, but I'll just go through basically line by line and explain it. So it takes RSpec and you pass the configure block. You can configure your expectations. I've never really changed this, but seems like something neat that you could do, but I won't go too much into it. This is an important config option so that if you're using RSpec mocks, that it makes sure that if you're creating a double of an object, that all of those methods on that object really exist. So you're not mocking methods that don't actually exist, because that would defeat the purpose of writing those mocks. If you're not into mocking with RSpec yet, don't sweat it. Don't worry about it yet. I've never changed this command option, so I'm not super sure what it does, but again, there's a really great description. And then now we get into the actual part of this config file that is commented out, but you really want to uncomment it out and make use of it. So what you do is you delete this begin file, which begins a comment, and if you go down to the end of the file, and you get rid of that commented out end, now we have new config options that were previously commented out. So it started right here with this file option. And this is nice because it allows you to focus on a specific test, which can sometimes be nice if you're trying to run a certain subset of a test. So for example, if I were to open up my spec, just my test spec, and if we add focus here, and then let's say we add another, it runs a second test, and we don't have focus there, and we'll just say expect true to not be false. That's kind of silly, but again, just for the case of example, and then if we run just that specific test again, only the one with focus should be run. Except, oh, I didn't actually save the spec helper. So let me save that again, run it. You'll see that only the it works example was run. Now if we remove the focus, run that again, it runs both examples. So that's nice. You can actually focus at any of the given describe blocks too. So you could do focus here, and then if we run the whole test suite, only this example will be run, which is nice. So if you ever wanted to run just one specific file or one specific example, you can use focus. Just make sure you don't commit your focus, and there are ways to prevent yourself from doing that, like with the Rubocop R-Spec gem, because if you commit your focus and then you push it your test suite up to CI, it's only going to run your focus tests, so it's not going to run out test suite, which would be less than ideal. This next example is a really nice one where, let's say you have a bunch of failing tests, and you are working on fixing your failing tests. So you're rerunning and rerunning your test suite. You don't want to run your whole test suite every time because it's really slow, right? If you had 20 tests and only 2 of them are failing, you don't need to run the other 18 if you already know they're passing. So what you can do is you can actually use the bin RSpec only failures. And what that'll do is it'll only run the tests that have failed. Now I have no failing tests, but we're going to make some to show you, for example. And what this config option does is it says, save those failing tests in examples.txt. So if we do cat examples.txt, we'll see that it actually keeps track of how all your specs are doing. And based upon whether it's passed or not, it knows whether or not to run it again. So now that we don't have focus again, we have spec examples.txt. Let's run the whole test suite. So it runs all of our tests, which is great. We'll output that file, and okay, it knows that all our tests are passing. What we're going to do now is we're going to go and write a failing test, and we'll just say it fails, and we'll say expect true to be false. Run the test suite again, sorry. That test should fail. Okay, great, it fails. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna output that cat-spec examples.txt, and we'll see that this test failed. So now it tracks it and it knows it failed. So let's say we're fixing our tests, or run bin R-Spec only dash failures. It'll only run that failing test, which is nice because then it's faster, and we know those other tests are passing right now. If we want to make it work, so we'll say it does not fail. We'll say expect true to be true. Run only failures again, it passes. Now if we output that examples.txt, we know they're all passing. So that's a really nice way to get if you have a lot of tests failing, to just work through them quickly without running all your other tests, is the only failures command flag option. And then if we run the whole test suite, once we have it all passing, we can then verify, okay, nothing else broke while we're making those changes. So that's a really great pattern. And you're going to want to ignore that spec/examples.txt in your git ignore. So we'll go ahead and we'll open our git ignore. Right now I'm just ignoring the SQLite 3 database, but we're also going to want to ignore spec/examples.txt. Yeah, so go ahead and save that. And then if you get status, we'll see that that file is not included, which is nice. And if for some reason you already did commit it, you would do git remove -f if you've already changed it in this point in time, and then do examples.txt, and that'll remove it from your files. But I actually don't have it being tracked, so we don't have to worry about that. So that's a really cool option. Not many people know about that, so I would suggest making use of it because it's really cool. Also, this next failure option is nice because it just does one failure at a time, so you can progress through that list of failures instead of running all the failures, which is super cool. This next option is it disables monkey patching. So what this does is, if you're not super familiar with monkey patching, it's just this way that you can, you don't need to specify the certain commands when you're in your RSpec files. It's probably not a great way to explain it, but back in the day, you used to be able to do just describe without that top level RSpec. And now if we run that again, we'll run just that file, test spec. We'll get the failure, right? Undefined method described for main object. And this is, you can read more about it at these blog posts. Generally speaking, monkey patching is not something you want to be doing in your tests. So if we comment that out, it works. But I would suggest not monkey patching and reading more about it if you're interested in learning more about it. I don't think I can do it justice explaining it, so I won't really try to. But keep that on, or keep that option turned on, and just remember at your top level describe, you just need to specify the RSpec constant .describe. Here's another option. I'm actually not. Oh yeah, I do like this one. So what this does is that if you're running just one file, one test file, it outputs the doc format, which we talked about earlier. But if you're running your whole test suite, then it just does the single dots. So for example, right, we run test spec, it uses the doc output, which is nice because if you're working on tests for a single class or a single feature, you can see what's working really quickly. But now if we run the whole test suite, which has 3 different test files, it's going to use the dot format. So that's really nice. We'll see the dot format here, and we'll dive into what these slowest examples mean in a sec. So yeah, keep that on if you want. You could delete this too if you could delete this if you wanted to too. If those are things that are totally up to your preference. Now what we have is something that I like, but it can be kind of noisy, is that when you run your tests, it outputs the 10 slowest examples. And this is key to pinpointing your slowest tests. And right now, right, I don't really have too many slow tests because we're not doing much with the database. We're not using Capybara yet, so it's all pretty fast, which is nice. But as your test suite grows and evolves, seeing your slowest examples in example groups is really nice. And if 10 is too much for you, you could change it to 2, so you could always see your 10 slowest tests. And for me in the past, that's been just a nice reminder that it just kind of lets you know when you run your tests, like, hey, you have some slow examples, and you might want to look into speeding them up in the future. But you could also just disable it by changing it to 0, and that will make your test output just a little cleaner. So, which is kind of nice. Actually, what happens if we set it to 0? Let's just see. So it doesn't output anything. Where here it says top 0. If you set it to 0, it doesn't output anything, which is kind of nice. For the rest of this screencast and for future episodes, I'm going to keep this to 0 because you can run bin RSpec, I think, profile, and that should output your slowest tests. So if you're spending some time on the hunt for slow tests, you can just do bin RSpec profile instead, but really up to you. I think that noise is kind of annoying personally when you're doing TDD, so I usually turn it off. This next option is really important, and it's that it runs your tests in random order, because you don't want your tests. So like, let's say you run one test, like in test spec, and let's say this changes the state of the world, and then you write this test to rely on that new state of things. That's generally not a good practice. Your tests should be, each example should be discrete in what it tests, and it shouldn't rely on other tests, so that you can easily change that test, you can easily move that test around, and it just makes it, you're not really, if something fails, you're not worrying about, oh, was it this other test that made it fail? So what you do is you set your config order to random, and that means the order of the tests that get run is different each time. So, for example, if I run bin RSpec, you know what we'll do? We'll do format doc, and that will output the actual text. So we'll see returns an array of consoles, works, does not fail. We run it again, and the order should be different because it's random each time, right? So this time it was works, does not fail, totally different order. And if, for example, you have an issue where your tests are failing because of the order, you would normally see this like on your CI system, right? You would push your code up and would run the tests, and you'd see it fail. And maybe you click restart to run it again, and you see it fails again for the same reason. Or maybe it doesn't fail again, which would be, you'd be kind of like, why did it fail in that one time? You would go, and in your test output, right, you would grab your seed, which is always output at the end of your tests, randomized with seed 18454. Then you can pass in your seed in the RSpec command, not the whole string, just the number. And that is the seed for the randomness. So if you run it again, we'll see it actually outputs the same order of the tests as last time, except I want format doc. So it should be testing RSpec works, does not fail for the first two. Yep, so it's the same order. So that's really nice and good to know, especially if you're debugging failing tests and you're not exactly sure why. And then if you can reliably reproduce that failure, you can pinpoint why it's failing and fix that. So that's, making it random is really important because it helps surface those issues and it prevents you from writing tests that depend on one another. And then secondly, you can use the seed option to go ahead and make that better. This is some more related to the seed, and this just says that it seeds the randomness of the Ruby kernel with your config seed. So you don't usually change this, but good to know what's going on there. So there's a spec helper. So when you're going to require a spec helper, right, we already know it's required by default with this .rspec file. I usually like to make it explicit at the top of my test, though, which one I'm requiring, because this spec helper is using just Ruby and just regular RSpec. It's not touching Rails. So if we had a class, let's just say we had a class called console, right? Because in the last example, we were talking about game consoles. And then we're going to test that. That console doesn't rely on Ruby at all because it's not an active record model. It's not a controller. It's not, it doesn't need Rails at all. And you might find code like this that doesn't need Rails at all in the lib directory. So like, you could put a class in lib, or you could write your own little library in lib, and then you would test that all by requiring spec helper, because that code typically doesn't rely upon the actual full Rails stack. And we'll dive more into what that means when I say the full Rails stack. But for this spec helper, it's just like if you were testing plain old Ruby code. And the reason why you'd sometimes want to require just spec helper is because it's blazing fast, because it's not loading all of Rails. So for example, if we're testing console, And we'll just do a quick, like, we'll just describe just a really quick method like games. And we'll say, or we'll just say name. This is a bad example. We'll say, we'll just call this formatted name. It's kind of wacky, but we'll pass an initializer. It'll be the name of the console and manufacturer. This is kind of like what we were working on the last episode. And then what we'll say is we'll create our console as, this comes back from the first episode of subject being described class dot new, and we'll pass in Switch, and we'll do Nintendo, right? And then here we'd say expect subject dot formatted name to equal Nintendo Switch, right? So that would be the full name, including the manufacturer and the name of the console. Although you might see that with like a first and a last name and then a full name. So then if we run this test, I'm going to clear this so it's easier to read, and we'll just do test spec, run it. It fails. Oh, I know it's wrong. I didn't do it. So it returns the manufacturer and the console name together. And that's nice for TDD because you get to run it right away, see it's failing. Undefined method formatted name, and see how quick that is. So now if we do formatted name, run it again, it fails really quick, which when we start using the Rails helper, we'll notice it's not as quick. We have, it returns nil, but we expect Nintendo Switch. So what we're going to do is we're going to do assign name to name, assign manufacturer to manufacturer, and then now it's accessible in other methods in this instance. So what we'll do is we'll return manufacturer concatenated with name. Save that, run it again, and you can see what do we have? A typo. I misspelled manufacturer wrong. Run it again. Runs really quick. So it took 0.0023 seconds, and it took 0.07 seconds to load. Now, if we make a really quick change here and make this Rails helper, run the test again. Do you see how much slower that is? It took 2.45 seconds to load. Now, the test took about the same amount of time, but that load time is how much time when you're running that RSpec process, it has to load files from your hard drive, right? So that's like, it's loading all of Rails, it's loading anything that's in Rails RSpec, or RSpec Rails, that's extra. And that's just the difference between this time, waiting, and then that time. That's huge when you're doing test-driven development, because you want that quick feedback loop, because your brain stays in the loop and you're not starting to think about, oh, what's someone tweeting, or what's the latest news, etc. So your spec helper is really nice when you're testing just regular old Ruby objects. And if you're not at the point where you're sure where you should use plain old Ruby objects, don't sweat it. Over time, I think it'll become more clear, and I'll create more screencasts in the future that explain that some more. So spec helper, great for plain Ruby objects. It's really fast. That's when you'd want to include it. Now, for the most part, if you're testing models or controllers, or you're doing, for example, our existing request specs, because we're testing the full API stack, you require Rails helper. Now let's change that to spec helper really quick so we can show you that it fails. So I changed that to spec helper. We'll go ahead and we'll run that test, and that lives in spec features, console spec, requests, console spec. And it fails because we have this undefined method get. And the reason why that method is undefined is that those HTTP methods for RSpec are included in the Rails helper. So now if we change it back to Rails helper, run it again, it passes. So that's great. Sometimes you just got to use Rails helper, and actually most of the time you will, and that's okay. You just kind of deal with it knowing that you have to load these files. And there are certain things like Spring in your app that you can use with RSpec that will make it a little quicker to run those tests over and over. But So that's Rails helper, and let's actually dig into what that file looks like. So open up Rails helper. It requires spec helper. So you see it's Rails helper relies upon spec helper. You want to keep them separate, but so just imagine Rails helper building upon the spec helper. It has Rails M settings, so it always sets it to test if it's not already set. And that lets your Rails app know that, okay, it's running in test mode. And different config options get brought in because of that. Brings in the environment config, and then it requires R-Spec Rails, which is that various methods and other things like that get method that we can use in Rails. This require relative is something I added in the last episode that loads a module that we include in the R-Spec configure. Here's a whole bunch of info on that support directory, which is funny because I just totally ignored that in the last episode, but you could load all of the files in the support directory by uncommenting this line. So if I actually delete this file, or delete that line, uncomment this file, and then if we run the whole test suite, that will load every file in support, in the spec support directory. So like if we do tree spec support, whoops, I don't have tree, so we'll just do spec support. It just has my request helper. So if you add more Ruby files there, this will require all of them automatically. So that's nifty that they provide that. Then move on here. This makes sure that your test migrations are run before you run your test suite, which is always good. This has to do with your fixtures. And if you're not using fixtures, like if you're using Factory Girl, which I think has a new name, but I forget it, or fabrication or something like that, then you could comment this line out. This has to do with transactional fixtures, which means that the changes that it uses, I could be wrong about this one. So pretty sure transactional fixtures means that when your test suite runs, it makes the changes to the database as a transaction and then rolls them back when it's done. Could be wrong about that though. Sorry that I don't know too much about that one right now. This next one is really important. And like I said, you can read more about this if you want, but just a really quick overview is that based upon where you put your spec in your spec directory, like whether it's spec features, spec models, spec controllers, R-Spec automatically determines what kind of test it is, and that allows different methods to be available. So for example, you wouldn't have to do this type controller. It would automatically know that it's a controller test. So that's cool. You want to keep that enabled, unless for some reason you wouldn't want to keep it enabled. And then filter Rails from backtrace, filter lines from Rails gems and backtraces. What that does is it makes it so that when your test fails, it doesn't output as much from the gems that are in your app. Like if you ever see an exception in your app, in like Rollbar, for example, or wherever you track your exceptions, you'll see like it goes and hits all of your gems up until that point that might be in your app, and it creates this really long output. And what this does is it cleans it out. So that's nice. And you can also filter specific gems. So like you could filter like, I don't know, if you had a gem in there like devise or something, you didn't want to see all the output, you could filter that out. But I've never actually messed with that, so you should just keep that as is. And then this config.include is a custom line of code that I added in the last episode that lets that request helpers, which I'll just open here so that we have it. It just includes that in all the files. So that's a nice thing to know. And you could do certain conditionals with the config to only include that in request specs. And yeah, that's kind of nice to be able to do. I can cover that in a future episode if that's useful for anyone. But yeah, so there's the Rails helper. It's less intense than the spec helper because there's just less to configure. And there's yeah, that's pretty much it. As if you ever need to learn how to do something, you can just Google it or read through the RSpec docs and you'll find what you need. But I hope this helped you understand the difference between spec helper and Rails helper, when to include it, when not to include it, and hopefully shed some light on what some of those config options do.